everyone, welcome back to the Nello Reads channel. Our first story of the day comes from Harry Seldon Was Wrong. Manager upset she couldn't leave her radio, throws it. It's been over a year since this happened. Let me premise that I wasn't the one maliciously complying. In fact, I was the one enforcing a rule. I also want to state there are some details I can't disclose for legal reasons. So, I used to work as a security guard in a large warehouse. Basically, my job was to stand at the exit and make sure employees weren't walking out with merchandise. In order to leave the building, you had to go through security. Basically, you had to have your bag checked and go through a metal detector. Also, employees were not allowed to take equipment home with them. Scanning guns, radios, etc. all had to stay in the warehouse. There was a notable exception. Certain managers were allowed to take their radios/laptops home if, and only if, they had a special badge which they had to show us every time they took equipment out. This was pounded into my head in training. No special badge meant they had to take the device back into the building. It wasn't our job to care where in the building they left it, just as long as it didn't leave. If it was lost in the building, that was their fault. We had a couple of cases every week of some worker forgetting they needed the badge to take their equipment when going out for a smoke break and having to do the walk of shame back in to put it back. Sorry for the long intro. Anyway, one day I'm standing at my post and a manager starts coming through towards the exit. She has a radio on her belt, but she isn't showing me a badge. I called out asking her to show me her badge. I always gave them the benefit of the doubt that they had permission to be taking tech out because sometimes someone who didn't used to have permission suddenly got it. Well, she glares at me, but keeps walking. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your badge before you take the radio out of the building, please. She keeps walking. Ma'am, if you attempt to leave with the radio, I'm going to have to report it to HR and loss prevention. That stopped her. She called out, "Well, what am I supposed to do with it? My station's all the way at the other end of the building, and I am not going back." It's just policy that you can't leave with it, ma'am. We sometimes have people leave their radios just inside if they're coming back quickly.
Well, I'll leave it with you then.
Unfortunately, ma'am, I'm not allowed to watch your equipment for you. If there's an emergency, I need to be able to focus on that. You'll need to take the radio back inside, but what you do with it then is your business.
So, you don't care what I do with the radio as long as it's inside?
That's correct, ma'am. The rest is up to you, your supervisor, and maybe IT.
Okay then.
She snapped the radio off her belt, wound her arm back like a bowler, got into a stance like she was preparing to bowl a ball in an alley at pins, and yeeted it into the building. It came to a landing and slid an additional 10 feet. Somehow, it didn't shatter on the concrete floor.
Have a nice day.
Then she left, leaving me gobsmacked. I had to write a report on the incident. One of the things we had to do was include footage of incidents from the cameras if there was any available. What was so funny was you could see the WTF look on my face even though I was wearing a mask. My managers would sometimes take screen clips of camera footage to save to show the rest of the team for training purposes. These were passed around to other guards for giggles. That video of her attempting to bowl her radio and then walking out, followed by my very clear WTF, was the top video shared amongst the guards for the next week. As for the manager, she wasn't fired, but I heard she got suspended for that stunt. I saw her going through a week later with a badge. I'm just wondering, what happened to the manager that made her so mad? Like, no sane person who is mildly inconvenienced throws their radio across the room. Like, surely there was a nearby table or something where you could just set it down real quick, right? I guess I'll never know. Our next story comes from an anonymous poster. You want a man to help you? No problem, one will clock in soon. This happened 16 years ago. When I was about 20 years old, I was a department manager in a big box hardware store. People said I acted 25, but I didn't even look 18. As a young female, I saw my fair amount of sexual discrimination, but the worst always came from women. This is the story of one such woman. I managed the paint department. I had 3 associates who worked for me. They loved me as a boss because I bought them a department radio and took the shifts they didn't want. I worked Friday close and Saturday mid, so my two younger guys could have time to have fun on Friday nights. The older gentlemen took early Saturday mornings so they could sleep off their fun. In trade, I gave the older gentleman his ideal schedule. My team was awesome. One day, I was in the department alone, and a lady came up and asked me where she could find the 5-gallon oil-based primer. I let her know that my location didn't carry the 5-gallon size of that primer. She told me that we did, and said that it was shelved right there, while suggesting I was too stupid to remember. Her husband gave me an apologetic look. I let her know that another location had what she was looking for, and that it was in fact in that exact location in that store. She let me know how stupid she thought I was for thinking she could mix up stores. Then she began yelling and loudly insisting that I get a man out there to help her, because she wanted someone competent and not a stupid little girl. Her husband actually tried to step in at that point, but I just smiled and let her know that a male paint associate would be clocking in any minute and that I would be happy to direct him to her as soon as he is on the clock. I smiled and waited for Joe to clock in. Joe was great, and I knew he could handle this or I wouldn't have put him in the situation. But Joe was also new. He was learning things super quick, but still relied on the rest of us for help. When I saw Joe walking up, I quickly said that there was a customer who needed help. I let him know that she was upset and asked him to do his best to answer her questions. Joe walked up to the lady. She said, "Finally, a man." She asked her question, explained where the product should be, and waited. Joe calmly let her know that he had never seen us carry 5-gallon sizes of oil-based primer, but said he could check with the paint department manager. She was happy and loudly said she was happy to be getting some real help. Joe walked up to me and started to ask me about 5-gallon oil-based primers. The lady quickly walked up and asked him what he was doing. He turned and said, "This is my manager. She runs this department." The husband laughed out loud, the woman stormed off, and I bought Joe lunch. The real MVP of this story is the husband. His wife definitely, and I know this for a fact, gave him the cold shoulder on the way home because he laughed. But I mean, who wouldn't laugh at that? That's pretty hilarious. Our third story comes from Broken Brainiac. Don't like me saying the textbook is wrong? Okay, the textbook says the textbook is wrong. I'm in college, and I have a social science requirement, even though it's unrelated to my major. Not too big of a deal, it's not a hard requirement to fill. However, the textbook for the class I signed up for to fill the requirement is ridiculous. I don't mean not my favorite, I mean that it teaches obviously untrue things in an attempt to justify the author's worldview, and it clearly should not be used for this course. A large part of this course is using a website to read material like the textbook and leaving comments on it that other students and the professor can see, with the intention of sparking thoughtful discussion. Several times I have commented how the textbook is clearly wrong, with my favorite being when it says, "There is no gene for race. Race is genetic," and cites black people with albinism as examples because they are white children born to black parents. That's a genetic disorder. The professor did not appreciate my disagreement. I don't know if there's any particular reason he didn't like it. He just didn't, and refused to talk with me in person about it. The professor replied to a couple of the comments telling me how I shouldn't argue against the text we're trying to learn from, especially since I'm only going on my own opinions. That last bit of the sentence got my attention. If the problem was my own opinions, then I figured I should have a source. Funny thing, with this textbook being poorly written, it contradicts itself a lot. So I start quoting the textbook itself when I disagree with it whenever I can find an applicable contradiction. You know, just to make sure it's not based on my own opinions. I couldn't always find a quote, but I sure looked, and if there was one to be found, I found it. One example is when I quoted the textbook saying medical disorders such as pregnancy when commenting on a section that said pregnancy was once incorrectly understood as a medical disorder but is now known to be a social issue. Not the most argument-worthy bit, I know, but the clearest contradiction. When I quoted the textbook, I even used formatted citation, author, page number, and everything, which amused my roommate to no end when I shared the story with him. The professor stopped telling me not to argue with the text, and in fact stopped replying to my comments at all. I haven't heard a word about it since, other than a classmate asking why the professor seemed so uncomfortable when I participated in a class discussion the day after. So I can't speak to the science related to this textbook, I don't know anything about it, but the story kind of makes me wonder, does this professor have some sort of outside incentive to keep using the book? Like, I know some professors get kickbacks from textbook companies, so maybe this book in particular has a really big one? I don't know. Anyway, our next story of the day is from Someone You Don't Know 70. Won't compensate me for my fence? Then compensate me 100 times as much for my crops. The malicious compliance in this story is not mine, it's my brother-in-law's. Some of the details may be slightly off, but the overall story is true. My brother-in-law grows avocados in California. Several years ago, a portion of his ranch was ravaged by a wildfire, or so he thought at first. When the smoke cleared, it became obvious that the fire was caused by an electrical line that was blown over by strong winds and had landed on his fence, catching it on fire. Since he had been planning on diversifying his crops anyway, he decided he'd simply replace his fence, replant, and move on. To that end, he called up the electric company that owned the downed line and asked them for about $10,000 in compensation to replace the fence that had been destroyed by their electrical line. They denied any and all culpability in the matter and told him that he should sue them if he didn't like it. What the electric company didn't realize was that my sister, his wife, works full-time as a corporate attorney for one of the largest utilities in California, defending against cases just like this one. At first, she was concerned that this utility was a subsidiary of her employer, in which case there would be a massive conflict of interest. Apparently, legal departments frown on their employees when their husband is suing them. Go figure. Thankfully, after some investigation, she realized that the utility in question was completely independent of her employer, and at that point, the gloves were off. My sister didn't represent her husband because she's typically on the other side of these cases, but she did advise him on everything he needed to bring to court to win his case, and she helped him find a very reputable lawyer with a solid record of winning cases like these. Not knowing what they were up against, the utility persisted in refusing to negotiate, hoping that by forcing my brother-in-law to trial, he would simply give up and go away. Spurred on by my sister's insistence that he had a solid case, he called their bluff and went to trial. As it turns out, California takes agricultural damage very seriously, and the court conducted its own independent investigation. It estimated the total damages at around $335,000, which is over 33 times as much as my brother-in-law had asked for initially. Furthermore, there is a law in California that awards triple damages in cases where agriculture is impacted. So the utility that had been unwilling to negotiate over $10,000 was now on the hook for over $1 million in damages. When all was said and done, my brother-in-law confided to me that he would have gladly settled for the $10,000 in arbitration, and that it would probably have taken him over a decade to even sell $1 million worth of crops. The utility had to have their day in court, though. I've gotta say, if someone wants to burn down my fence and give me $1 million for it, be my guest, go right ahead. So, not bad, OP. Not bad at all. I hope you enjoyed today's stories, and I'll see you in the next one.